passwords, and you stated that we should get away from passwords altogether. Can you elaborate on that? Mr. Fu, Congressman Long brought up the issue of default passwords, and you stated that we should get away from passwords altogether. Can you elaborate on that?
Right. I mean, so passwords is just intrinsically insecure. You know, we're human. We write them down. We choose poorly. So pretty much any password system is going to encourage unwise security behavior. There are some technologies out there. There's one company in Ann Arbor, for instance, Duo, that does something called two-factor authentication, where you have, for instance, a mobile phone in addition to a password. But at the heart of it, we need to figure out other ways, and I'm going to defer to the other witnesses for suggestions on that, but I just feel we really need to retire passwords. We need to kill those off, because these are going to be bringing down our most sensitive systems.
Yeah, do any of y'all want to elaborate on that at all?
So I largely agree. I mean, there's always be a role for passwords. There will be low security device applications, low amounts of latency times when you only need to secure for a short amount of time. But in general, passwords have outlived their usefulness. And there are other technologies. You can secure your Gmail account now with a code that comes to your phone as a second factor. Right, I can secure this with my fingerprint. There are many other systems that give us more robust authentication. And I think that would go a long way in a lot of our systems to help secure them. Because we're talking about two different ways to break into things. We're talking about vulnerabilities, which are exploited. We're talking about bad user practice, which is also exploited. And if I can get rid of one of them, or at least reduce it, I'm going to go a long way to make things better.
Okay, great. Well, I'm out of time, and thank you all for your time, and I'll yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. The chair would recognize Mr. McNerney for the purposes of follow-up question.
Well, I thank the chair for an opportunity to ask another question. This one is a little philosophical, so I hope you don't mind. Mr. Snyder, you mentioned that the attacks are easier than defense on this complex system. And making more complexity opens up new vulnerabilities. But biological systems work in the other way. They build complexity in order to defend themselves. Is there some kind of parallel we can learn from on this?
So, in the past decade or so, there's been a lot of research in sort of moving the biological metaphors of security into IT. And there are some lessons and there are some things that don't work. Right? Biological systems tend to sacrifice the individual to save the species, which is kind of not something we want to think about in IT or even in our society. But yes, there are ways of thinking about a security immune system, but the complexity of a biological system is complexity that's constrained. So, for example, we all have a different genome, and that gives us a resistance, our species, against a disease. And you might be able to do that with an operating system, but it's not going to be 2 or 3. It's going to be billions of different operating systems, which is suddenly much more expensive by orders and orders of magnitude. So a lot of the lessons don't apply, some do, and the researchers are trying to learn from them. And that is kind of the new cool way of thinking. And I think there's a lot of value there. But still, complexity, unintended consequences, interconnections, the attack surface, the enormous attack surface we're talking about, makes it so that in at least the foreseeable future, attack will have the advantage. My guess is there will be some fundamental advances in security, which will give us, maybe not in our lifetimes, but eventually, a defensive advantage, but no time soon.
All right, thank you. Mr. Chairman, you're back.
Thank you. And Mr. Schneider, just recognize myself for a follow-up question. You had mentioned along this line, and then you had mentioned in I think, response to an earlier question about the autonomous vehicles. And yes, yesterday in our Commerce Manufacturing Trade Subcommittee, we did have a hearing on autonomous vehicles. So particular vulnerabilities or places where the focus should be as that autonomous vehicles, self-driving vehicles develop as a separate entity?
So I think it's a really interesting test bed for what we're thinking about. And I don't know how much detail you went into on the vulnerabilities, but what we learned is the vulnerabilities are surprising. There's one attack that used the DVD player as a way to inject malware into the car that controlled the engine. Now, that shouldn't be possible, but surprise. And similarly, I'm worried about the USB port on the airplane seat, potentially controlling the avionics. The airline companies will say that's impossible, but those in computer security don't believe it. So again, the more holistic we can be, the better. There are always going to be surprises. So to get back to the immune system model, how do we build resilience into the system? How do we ensure that it fails safely and fails securely? How do we ensure, or at least make it more likely, that a vulnerability here doesn't migrate to another vulnerability there, causing something more catastrophic? So the more we can look at the big picture, the less we focus on this or that, because it's the connections. And so if you think about it, it's exponential. And I have 5 things, that's 25 connections. I have 100 things, that's 10,000 connections. It goes up by a factor of square. Just did some math, so a little sorry here. But now that's the vulnerability. And that's why that's why complexity is such a problem.
Well, I posed a question earlier, and really this is for any of the 3 of you who wish to answer. The